Imagine this. You're sipping coffee in your own living room, and your front door doesn't knock, it explodes open. What would you do if your HOA president stormed in, screaming about immediate compliance, while the state's top prosecutor is standing in your kitchen? My name's Rex Holloway. I'm a Michigan boy, through and through. Raised on fish fries, snow tires, and neighbors who shovel each other's driveways without being asked. A few years back, after a rough divorce, I moved into my late granddad's lake cabin on the edge of a place called Lakeshore Pines. 2 and a bit acres, yeah. About 2.3 of cedar trees and water hush. Hand-built after Korea by a man who could turn a crooked plank into a porch swing. If you ever ran your fingers along hand-hewn cedar that still smells like Old Spice and sawdust, you know why I fell in love with the place. It wasn't just land. It was legacy. And then there was Karen. Karen, how do I say this politely? She's the human version of a paper cut you can't get rid of. Late 50s. All iron khakis, and that tight little smile that says, "Bless your heart, but I'm about to ruin your day." She'd failed out of insurance, adjusting a lifetime ago, that's how folks told it, and somehow found religion in bylaws. She bulldozed her way into the HOA presidency in under 2 years, promising to protect property values. What she did was patrol the neighborhood in a spotless 3-row SUV with a clipboard and a measuring tape, hunting for sinners, bird feeders, vermin attractants. A Vietnam vet's flagpole, a few inches too tall, immediate removal or daily fines. A widow's wind chimes, noise pollution. But Karen had a special itch for my place. The cabin sat on the best slice of old lakefront, built long before any HOA existed. First time she showed up, she handed me a courtesy notice listing 47 violations. 47. Everything from the dock being allegedly 3 feet too long, to my fire pit being an unpermitted combustion structure. $500 in fees, plus $75 a day, until I complied. I told her, calm as I could, that my cabin stood decades before the HOA was a twinkle in anybody's eye. Karen smiled that thin, cold smile, and said, "Previous ownership is irrelevant. Mr. Holloway, all properties within HOA jurisdiction must comply. Regardless of construction date, you have 30 days, or we file a lien." She said lean, like she was tilting her head into my life. That night, I drove to the county courthouse and started digging. I mean, I ain't a lawyer, but I can read. What I found had my hands shaking. Turned out the HOA paperwork had been filed a few months after Granddad died, with his signature mysteriously on it. The developer's son, who just happened to sit on Karen's board, had filed it. It didn't smell like a clerical error. It smelled like fish left in a truck bed in July. Fraud. Plain as a boot print. Proving it, though, was gonna take more than gut. I needed receipts. I needed patience. And I needed a plan 10 times better than Karen's petty brand of tyranny. A week later, at 6:30 in the morning, Karen rolled up with a surveyor and a local shop owner named Dale. They stomped around my place for hours. Karen barking orders, snapping photos through my windows. I kid you not. Lucky me. I'd installed security cameras the night before. Every moment. Recorded. Squeaky clean. Later I learned Dale owed back taxes bigger than a new outboard, and that Karen's old insurance license had been pulled for irregularities. You could cut the hypocrisy with a butter knife. The surveyor, a jittery guy named Jimmy, whispered that Karen paid him half, and pressured him to discover violations that didn't exist. "Help me get my money back," he said, "and I'll testify." The next day my camera caught him, well, relieving himself behind my shed. Not a crime, but embarrassing. When Karen heard, she went volcanic. "I'm reporting this as a health code violation," she shrieked. "Sure," I told her, "but maybe explain why you hired him in the first place." Comedy might have carried the day if she hadn't already slapped me with a lawsuit north of $12,000 and pushed to shut down my dock while court sorted it out. Her worst move, though, came at Murphy's Diner, where she told anyone with an ear that I was a dangerous, unstable veteran. That wasn't just ugly, that was defamation. And it built a neat little pattern of harassment for the countersuit I was already drafting in my head. Every photo, every text, every word. I documented it all. Karen thought she was tightening a noose. She was stitching her own straitjacket. I hired a property attorney out of Grand Rapids named Stella Crawford Sharp Eyes. Sharper grin. Over coffee she said, "Michigan's got private attorney general statutes. If you uncover systematic fraud, you can sue on behalf of everyone victimized. Also, your cabin predates the HOA. Odds are you're not even subject to their rules." Music to my ears. But, we still needed proof you could set on a courtroom table. At the next HOA meeting, Dale let slip in front of the whole board that the formation paperwork was sketchy from day one. The room went dead quiet. Karen looked like she'd been smacked with her own clipboard. And then my neighbors started coming out of the woodwork. Martha, who'd been forced to dig up the garden her late husband planted 40 years earlier because the flowers were non-conforming. Tom, an Afghanistan vet who said he'd never been more afraid of anyone in his life than of a woman with a measuring tape. The young couple fined because their twins drew chalk rainbows on the sidewalk. One by one, folks started seeing the pattern. Karen targeted the vulnerable, squeezed the silent, and called it community standards. Instead of backing off, she doubled down. Daily compliance inspections. Calls to my mortgage servicer through her brother-in-law at the bank. Phony environmental complaints. She'd show up at 9 at night, squatting behind my bushes to catch infractions. It was like living next door to a stalker with a spreadsheet. My daughter called from college, worried sick. My ex wanted to know how I planned to pay legal fees and tuition. I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about legacy, my granddad's cabin and every neighbor she'd hurt. Then the money trail cracked open. $67,000 missing from HOA reserves. Funneled to a shell company with Karen's name on it. A company that had never managed a single property. That cash, we later found, propped up her son's doomed restaurant and covered some gaming debts. My cameras also caught her close to midnight, dumping a bag of rotting fish near my septic tank. Then calling the county first thing with an anonymous complaint. The inspector showed, took a sniff, and said, "Smells like Friday fish fry from Murphy's." Karen, in pink gardening gloves, looked ready to pass out. A private investigator named Danny, Jimmy's brother, admitted Karen hired him to dig dirt on me. He handed over recordings. Crystal clear. Find something or make it up. I'll pay a bonus if it sticks. Both brothers agreed to testify. Karen's web was unraveling fast. Desperate people do dumb things. Karen filed a false police report, claiming I threatened her with military training. The officer, after reviewing my mountain of evidence, just shook his head and said, "Keep documenting. She even tried to bribe the county inspector and paid a teenager $50 to dump motor oil by my dock. Every stunt fed our case. Then Channel 7 News rolled up my drive. Cameras rolling. Karen had pitched them a sob story about a dangerous vet terrorizing the neighborhood. I let the reporter in. Set out documents. Footage. Neighbor statements. The whole spread. The story aired that night. Not the way she wanted, but as the truth. HOA horror when neighbors attack. The state attorney general's office announced an investigation. Victims across Michigan started calling. Forming a wave. Stella called and said, "We're not alone anymore." We organized a little coffee club in my living room, Martha. Tom. The young couple. A retired teacher named Ed. A nurse named Lila. And me. We mapped what we knew on butcher paper fraud. Harassment. Financial abuse. We set up a defense fund at the hardware store. Folks dropped in crumpled bills and change. You could feel the neighborhood's spine straightening. And in Granddad's old trunk under his medals and letters, I found the final proof, the original deed from 1960, showing the property line stretched 40 feet farther than anyone had mapped, right under Karen's rose garden and gazebo. Her improvements sat on my land. The crooked foundation of that crooked HOA was drawn on the wrong dirt. The morning I called the Attorney General's office to request a meeting, my hands were steady for the first time in months. Their investigator, a quiet guy with a jaw like a cinder block, listened for an hour and said, "Bring everything. We'll come to you." We set the date. We brewed a lake's worth of coffee. Martha baked pies. Tom stacked firewood. I cleaned the place, like a man waiting on judgment. The neighborhood hummed with this electricity, not fear anymore, but resolve. Just before noon, the state SUV rolled down my lane. Out stepped Attorney General Santos, mid-40s. Tailored coat. Eyes that had seen every angle of a scam and didn't blink. We shook hands in my kitchen, where Granddad used to carve roasts on Sundays. I laid out binders, thumb drives, envelopes. As I walked her through every piece, the forged formation, the missing money, the fish dump, the recordings, she took notes like a court stenographer and asked surgical questions. Chain of custody, original timestamps, witness corroboration. We were halfway through the neighbor's statements when the cabin door didn't knock. It detonated. Karen burst in with her clipboard like a weapon and that tape measure hanging from her wrist like a sheriff's pistol. Immediate compliance inspection. She barked, "There's unauthorized parking." And she finally looked up and saw the badge hanging from Santos's neck. Nobody moved. I could hear the lake tapping shyly against the dock. Santos didn't flinch. "Ma'am," she said, calm, almost gentle, "you have just committed multiple offenses, including trespass and harassment, in front of the chief law enforcement officer of this state. Please step outside while we discuss your potential criminal exposure." Karen's face went white as skim milk. For a heartbeat, I thought she might faint. Then, she tried to recover. "I'm simply enforcing community standards." "Sure," Santos said. "And I'm simply enforcing the law." Karen backed onto the porch like she'd found a snake nest. My neighbors peered from the trees. I swear you could feel the whole subdivision holding its breath. "Inside," Santos said. "Mr. Holloway." "Continue." I showed the deed. The original one, with the surveyor's penmanship neat as church music. "This line," I said, "puts her garden, gazebo, and that silly stone birdbath on my soil." Santos nodded. "We'll verify with the state land office." She tapped the folder labeled financials Let's talk about the $67,000. We walked through it all. Checks to Karen's shell company for consulting. A management contract no one had authorized. Vendor payments to a restaurant that never delivered services. Casino withdrawals that lined up a little too nicely with HOA debit card swipes. Stella joined by speakerphone and outlined the civil angle. Private Attorney General. Class-style relief. Treble damages if the court found racketeering. Alleged racketeering. Santos corrected. Right. Stella said. Alleged. By dusk, Santos closed her notebook and said, "We'll take it from here." She shook my hand again and thanked Martha for the pie. Which, by the way, was blueberry and tasted like every county fair ribbon ever won. Karen, who'd waited on the road, chewing her lip, tried one last play. Can I offer some context?" Santos's voice stayed flat. "You can do that with counsel present." That night, the stars laid down hard and bright over the water. Tom built a fire. The kind that keeps the chill away from memory. We didn't celebrate. We just breathed. Rex. Martha said, "I ain't slept right in 2 years." Same. Tom said, "I keep waiting for headlights to slow at my mailbox." I stared at the cabin. At Granddad's hammer marks still visible in the rafters. "We're almost there," I said, though part of me wondered if there even existed when bullies had clipboards. Days later, things moved fast. Faster than I expected. Honest. Investigators called neighbors. Subpoenas started flying. The county clerk found anomalies in how the HOA had been recorded. Bank statements came in. Karen's board scattered like pigeons in a parking lot when a truck backfires. Then a wrinkle. A friendly clerk warned us that Karen was trying to push an emergency vote to retro-ratify the HOA and cement control. "She's gonna claim it was all a misunderstanding," the clerk said, "and that the community wants continuity." We needed to show up. So we did. The meeting was in the clubhouse. A boxy building with bad carpet and better acoustics for arguing. Karen stood at the front under the fluorescent hum. Hair sprayed into battle formation. Lips pressed thin enough to slice paper. She launched into a speech about stability and values and protecting our way of life. I raised my hand. "Point of order," I said. "You can't ratify fraud. You can't accuse people of crimes." "Mr. Holloway," Karen snapped. "Without proof." "Sure," I said. "That's why the state took my proof." The room buzzed like a hive. Karen's eyes flicked toward the back, where the local reporter sat with a notebook. Martha stood. "Karen made me rip out the roses my husband planted in 1983. Her voice quivered. "Said the variety was non-compliant. He's gone now. Those roses were all I had." Tom stood. "Karen told me my flagpole height dishonored the flag. I fought in Helmand. I watched good men fall. She doesn't know a thing about honor." A dozen more neighbors rose. Stories spilled like marbles. Rolling everywhere. Fines for chalk drawings. Threats about mailboxes. Tickets for a lawn chair left on a porch. You could feel the room tipping. Karen banged her little gavel so hard the handle cracked. "Order! Order!" Stella stepped in. Calm as a lake at dawn. "As counsel," she said, "I'd advise the board to suspend all enforcement until the Attorney General concludes the investigation." "Who is this Karen?" hissed. "Opposing counsel," Stella said, "and the person who will question you under oath." The vote to retro-ratify failed by a landslide. Karen left early, jaw clenched, clipboard hugged to her chest like a life preserver. You'd think that would cool things down. Instead, Karen got meaner. Not louder, meaner. Quiet letters slid under doors at night. Friendly warnings with dollar signs in the margins. A neighbor's tires mysteriously slashed. A dead squirrel tossed onto Lila's porch. It was petty. Schoolyard stuff. But it wears you down. There's folks who can take a punch if they see it coming. It's the pinpricks that make you bleed out. One windy afternoon, I walked the shoreline and tried to pray without knowing what to say. Granddad's dock creaked like it was answering. I could see him. Big hands. Bigger laugh. Telling me, stand straight. Son. Bullies tilt when you don't. Channel 7 followed up with a longer piece. Not sensational. Just steady. They interviewed Martha beside the dirt where her roses used to be. They filmed Tom folding the flag. They showed the clubhouse vote. The phone at my cabin started ringing like a church bell. People from across the state. From up by the Sioux to down near the border. Calling with stories that sounded like ours. Some said their Karens weren't named Karen. But the script matched weaponized bylaws. A taste for power. A gift for picking on the tired and the busy. The Attorney General's office scheduled a second visit. This time with a forensics accountant. A white-haired woman who looked like your favorite aunt and added columns like a magician. Cash doesn't lie, she murmured, while highlighting statements. She traced round-robin transfers. Fees with no services. A management bonus that landed in Karen's husband's account the same day the HOA sent a vendor check. Allegedly, she kept saying. Because that's the word you use until the gavel hits wood. The private investigator, Danny, brought more audio. If we can't find violations, Karen's voice hissed. We create them. Our standards allow discretion. He'd laughed on the tape. Nervous. Discretion. Right. In person. He didn't laugh. I'm ashamed. He told Santos quietly. My mama raised me better. A week later, just past dawn, a convoy rolled into Lakeshore Pines. Not loud, deliberate. Unmarked sedans. 2 black SUVs. County cruisers. Agents in windbreakers stepped out and fanned across tidy lawns. Karen came out in a fleece vest and pearls like she'd been plucked from a catalog. For a second, she squared her shoulders like she planned to argue jurisdiction with the sky. Then, she saw Santos. Neighbors gathered in clumps, hugging mugs against the cold, whispering names of charges they'd learned from television. A deputy read words, I won't pretend I remember in perfect legal order. Karen's clipboard fell from her fingers and clacked on the driveway like a crown knocked off. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just stood with Martha and Tom and Lila and breathed steam into the air. The news trucks came back. Of course. The story ran statewide allegations of forged formation, financial abuse, harassment, environmental fakery, threats, intimidation. The board resigned in a single paragraph that said something like, family obligations. A judge appointed a receiver to keep the lights on while everything got sorted. Stella filed the big civil action on my behalf, and, more important, on behalf of every person in Lakeshore Pines who'd been shaken down or shamed. Weeks lengthened and softened. My daughter came home from college for a long weekend and sat with me on the dock. Dad, she said, I'm proud of you. I don't cry easy. That about did me in. She told me campus friends had seen the story online. There's people who think HOAs keep things nice, she said. And then there's this. She waved a hand at the water. At the pines. At the cabin that had taught me patience, one board at a time. We started fixing what Karen broke that you can fix with hands. The neighbors came together. Almost shy at first. Like deer stepping out after a storm. We replanted Martha's roses. A quilt of old varieties whose names sounded like hymns. Tom, who, turns out, is a wizard with an auger, helped set a proper flagpole. Regulation height. Saluting the wind. No measuring tape required. Lila organized a Saturday potluck that felt like a homecoming nobody realized they needed. There was still the matter of Karen's gazebo and rose garden sitting on my land. I could have had it all ripped out in a day. Instead, we held a meeting on my porch. Look, I said, scratching my neck. I don't want a shrine to her on my property. But I don't want a crater either. Martha suggested a compost bin and a native plants corner. Tom suggested a bench with a plaque for Gold Star families. Lila suggested a raised bed for herbs folks could snip on their way to supper. We did all three. It stopped being hers the minute we put a shovel in the dirt. Court doesn't move at the speed of revenge. It moves at the speed of paperwork. Months crawled and jogged and sometimes sprinted. The criminal case rolled forward under wraps, the way those cases do. The civil case churned through motions and discovery. Stella, patient as snowfall, kept explaining, we build. We don't break. Karen's defenders faded. But a few diehards clung to the idea that some rules are good. Sure, seatbelts are good. Too. It's the person who weaponizes a seatbelt to strangle you that's the problem. When they tried the old protecting property values line on me at the hardware store, I smiled and said, my property value's just fine when my roses are allowed to bloom. I started sleeping better. Not perfect. I'd still wake to shadows sometimes and think clipboard, but better. The cabin's old bones stopped creaking so much in my head. On Sunday mornings, I'd make a skillet of eggs and sit in the doorway with coffee while loons stitched the lake with calls. There's a kind of quiet that isn't empty. It's full of everything you've kept. Santos called one afternoon and said, we're nearing the end. She has this way of compressing 1,000 pages into 4 words. I thanked her, stammered something about pies, and she laughed. Blueberry. Please. The hearing that mattered most wasn't cinematic. It was beige walls and a judge with bifocals and a voice that sounded like he was tired of nonsense. The receiver presented findings. The accountant laid out the numbers. Stella spoke about neighbors who'd been treated like inventory. Karen's lawyer did what he could. That's his job. Then the judge spoke. And we all listened like kids around a radio. He dissolved the HOA. He ordered restitution. He barred Karen from serving on any board handling funds. The criminal proceedings, he said, would continue on their own track. Karen didn't look at us on her way out. Her jaw was clenched so hard I worried for her teeth. I caught myself feeling a flicker of pity. Then I remembered Martha's roses, Tom's flag, the chalk drawings, the midnight fish dump, the quiet letters under doors. Pity belongs to the repentant. Karen didn't wear repentance. We walked out together into winter sun. It felt like the cabin stood taller. What now? Tom asked. Hands in pockets. Now, I said. We build what they tried to fake. We started small. A Saturday cleanup. A bulletin board at the hardware store that said, need help. Put your name. And got time. Take a name. Lila organized meal trains for new parents and folks recovering from surgeries. Ed, the retired teacher, started a book swap. Martha, bless her, created a seed library with envelopes of heirloom beans and squash labeled in looping cursive. Tom hosted fishing mornings for vets who needed a quiet place to put heavy stories down. We made rules. Sure, the kind that work like fences you can see over. Be kind. Ask first. Leave no mess behind. We didn't need a gavel. We needed a thermos and a rake. The coffee can fund grew into a proper ledger in a notebook that sat on my mantel. Every dollar in, every dollar out. Written in ink. Folks trusted it because they could touch it. I kept telling people, transparency ain't a slogan. It's a habit. My ex and I found easier footing. My daughter came by more often. She'd sit at the table doing homework and say, "Hey, Dad, ethical dilemmas are wild." And I'd laugh and say, "You have no idea." Sometimes I'd catch her tracing the grain in Granddad's table like I once did. And it would hit me that this cabin had carried more holloways than its square footage should allow. Spring teased. Ice broke. Loons returned. So did a few old skeptics. Shuffling up my path with casseroles and cautious apologies. We hugged without words. There's misjudgment. And then there's straight-up malice. Most folks live on the first side. One evening, as the sun laid copper on the water, Martha brought over a small wooden box. Inside were seeds from her original rose bed. "I saved these," she said softly. I was angry, but I kept faith. I held the seeds like a fragile verdict. We planted them near the bench Tom had set for Gold Star families. We watered them and waited. The day the criminal case ended felt less like fireworks and more like an exhale you didn't know your lungs could make. Karen took a plea on some counts, fought others, and lost enough to see years measured out. The board's former treasurer cooperated fully and got a lighter sentence. Dale, the tire guy, cried on the stand and promised to make good. Jimmy and Danny testified and then disappeared from the news into lives I hope are straighter. Reporters called, asking for quotes. I said what I could say without gloating. We're not against rules. We're against rule by fear. One of them asked if I had advice for other neighborhoods. I said, document. Organize. Don't let shame isolate you. Bullies thrive in the dark. Neighbors kept building. The gazebo, once Karen's showpiece, became a shade for potlucks and grief groups and late afternoon chess. The compost bin turned kitchen scraps into soil for Martha's reborn rose bed. Lila's herb garden smelled like a dozen suppers. Kids chalked cartoons across the walkway. And the only thing anyone said was, "Pass me the blue." I started a quiet retreat for vets at the cabin on long weekends. Simple stuff, coffee, a place to fish, a table where you can sit without explaining yourself. Tom ran the boat. Ed read aloud lines from old books that felt like they had spines. The lake kept our secrets. Sometimes I still wake at night. Habit, I guess. I walk to the porch and listen to the water nudge the shore. I think about Granddad. I think about the day Karen kicked my door and found the Attorney General at my kitchen table. I think about how fear shrinks a life and how courage, even clumsy courage, the kind with and I mean all over it, stretches a life back out. There's folks who say HOAs are necessary. Maybe in some places. Sure. But no association should be a cudgel. No neighbor should be a cop. Communities, what happens when we pick up a rake for each other? Not when we weaponize a tape measure. I ain't naive. People get messy. That's why grace matters. That's why truth in ink matters. That's why a bench by a lake can do more for property values than 1,000 friendly notices. On the anniversary of the day, everything broke open. We held a picnic. Not to celebrate Karen's fall, to honor what rose. Folks brought potato salad and stories. We read the names of neighbors who had moved away or passed on during the long storm. We let their memories sit in the shade with us. Santos came, quiet as always, and set a store-bought pie on the table like it was church. I teased her about Blueberry, and she smiled. Figured I owed you one. She didn't make a speech. Didn't need to. She shook hands and asked after people's dogs and gardens. That's the thing about real authority, it doesn't need to thump. At sunset, I walked out onto the dock with my daughter. The lake wore the sky like a borrowed dress. Dad, she said, do you ever wish we just ignored it? Nah, I said. Ignoring rot doesn't stop the smell. Besides, look. I pointed back at the shore where Martha laughed with Lila over the herb bed. Where Tom showed a kid how to untangle fishing line without cussing. Where Ed traded books from his cardboard box library. This is worth the fight. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I'm gonna tell this story someday. Tell it plain, I said. Tell it like a porch light. We sat a long time without talking. The loons called. The pines kept their arms wide. And I thought, how one bully united a whole neighborhood. How justice didn't just arrive, it took root. Grew leaves. Cast shade. So, what would you do if your HOA nightmare turned into a fight for your whole community? Anyone else had a HOA do this to you? Drop your story down in the comments. Somebody out there might need your courage tonight.